Hi, this is Lauren from the Otto Bruins Public Library of Northfield. Today we're going to be making Anadama bread, which is a loaf that originates from New England. It's a pretty simple bread loaf, but it has cornmeal and molasses in it. That's what makes it a little special. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to get a packet of yeast, which is equivalent to 2 teaspoons and 1/4 of a teaspoon of yeast. I also got a pinch of sugar in there. That'll help the yeast activate. This is warm water. It's really important that you don't use hot water. Hot water will kill the yeast. So this really should be the temperature of bath water. If you have a thermometer, it's about 110 degrees. You're going to want to set this aside for 5 to 10 minutes until it gets all frothy and we can see that the yeast has been activated. While we wait for the yeast to activate, we're going to simmer our cornmeal with some water on a very low temperature. You want to keep an eye on it and stir it a few times. So this is 1/4 cup of cornmeal and 1/2 cup of water. And I'll show you what the consistency should look like when it's done. Alright, so this was on the stove for only 2 or 3 minutes at a low temperature. You're going to want to stir it while it's simmering. You can see the consistency got a lot thicker. It's almost like polenta now. And while this is still warm, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of butter. I'm using a non-dairy butter substitute, which will make this vegan, but you can go ahead and use dairy butter. We're also going to add 1/2 cup of molasses. This gives the bread a golden color and it has very nice flavor, brings a little sweetness to the bread. Alright, our yeast has been sitting for a while now. You can see it got very frothy. You should be able to smell the yeast too. That means we're good to go. The yeast is alive and activated. I'm using a standing mixer. You can definitely do this by hand. It'll just take a little more work. So the first thing you're going to add to the yeast mixture is our molasses, cornmeal, butter mixture. I'm going to mix my dry ingredients in a separate bowl. Got 3 cups of all-purpose flour. Into that I'm adding a teaspoon of salt, and then these 2 are optional. I just think they pair well with the molasses. It's 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon and 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. Now we're going to combine our wet ingredients with our dry ingredients. Just pour maybe 1/3 of the dry ingredients in at a time. You don't want to overwork the mixer. And I'm starting out with this batter attachment. Slowly adding in the rest of our flour. At this point in mixing, the dough started to come together and pulled away from the sides of the bowl. That's a good cue to know it's time to start kneading. So if you're doing this in a mixer, you'll use a dough hook attachment to knead. If you're doing this by hand, you're going to want to put this on a well-floured surface and knead by hand. It's going to take about 5 minutes or so of kneading. Alright, after kneading for a few minutes, the texture of your dough should have changed a lot. It's very elastic, it's totally smooth, there's no dry spots at all. It will definitely be a little sticky, that's thanks to the molasses. I prepared a well-oiled bowl. This is what the dough will rise in. Turn the dough around a few times to get it covered in oil on all sides. And then this is going to rise about an hour. You want it to double in size, but it will really depend on the temperature of your house. My house is pretty cold, so I might put it in front of a heater to help it along. Okay, this has been rising for about an hour and a half because my kitchen's pretty cold. I let it go a little longer. It's definitely doubled in size. If you look on the sides and the bottom of your bowl, you should see lots of little air bubbles. And when you touch the dough, it should slowly spring back. That's a good sign that it's done. So you're going to want to knead this just lightly for a minute or two to get out any large air bubbles. And you'll notice that the texture of the dough has changed significantly. It's much lighter than it was before, and it should have a good stretch to it like that. So kneading is what develops the gluten in your flour. That's what makes bread nice and chewy. So after kneading it, I only kneaded it like a minute or two. I'm going to just use my hands to flatten it a little bit. And now we're going to start forming the loaf. So you're going to take one end, the top end, stretch it out a little bit and fold it a third of the way down like a letter. And then I'm using the heel of my hand to press down on that seam. Flip it over and we're going to do the same thing. Stretch it out and pull it over. Seal the seam. Now we're going to fold it in half one more time. Just roll it on over to itself like that. Sealing the seam one last time. And now this is a buttered dish. You definitely want to grease it with butter or oil. Now that our loaf is formed, the way we formed it is just going to make it rise very evenly when it bakes. Plop it in right there, and the last thing you're going to do is, again, use the heel of your hand to press it down into the pan, into all the corners. This is going to rise one more time for a little less, maybe a half hour to 40 minutes until it doubles again. And in the meantime, you can preheat your oven to 375 degrees. This has been rising for about 40 minutes, so not as long as the first rise. It did puff up, but not as much as the first rise. You can see all those air bubbles on the side and bottom. So this is good to go. We're gonna bake it in a 375 degree oven. We're gonna check it first at 35 minutes, but there's a good chance it will need more time after that. Our bread loaf is done. It ended up being in the oven for about 43 minutes. If you want to be extra careful, you can use a thermometer, which is what I did. It should read between 190 and 200 degrees when it's done. Now you can see the top is a very dark brown. Don't be afraid to let it get this dark. It's not burnt. This is what it will look like when it's cooked all the way through. The hardest part of this whole recipe is waiting for it to cool. You really want to let it cool all the way to room temperature before you cut into it. If you cut into it while it's still hot, it will affect the structure of the crumb inside the bread. Alright, that's how you make Anadama bread. It's pillowy and soft, but still has good chew to it, and the molasses flavor really comes through. I got this recipe from my grandma, so shout out to Grandma Nora. I hope you decide to make this at home and let us know how it turns out.